Strings are foundational for us, right? Mostly because strings are one way where we can capture what we normally speak in English or in any other language. So we use strings all over the place, right, to communicate things, etc. But there's also an abstract notion that strings as a collection of characters, independent of language or anything, can be interesting for various reasons. I'll give an example. You can think of the DNA sequence, which becomes a whole interesting course on bioinformatics, which I recently ran. You can think of a DNA sequence as a string, right? And human genetic information is encoded in a string. And then you can ask questions like, how can I manipulate that string programmatically? Right? So strings are a flexible data structure. It just means it's a collection of characters. And the characters don't have to be alphabets. They can be integers. They can be, whatever you want. Okay? So fine. So creating a string. So let's now I'm creating a pattern here. I want you to go back after this session and look at lists again. You'll see that the discussion on strings, I've tried to mirror our discussion on lists. So right now, if you're very strong on lists, you'll find a lot of the discussion here to be fairly easy for you to follow. So what is the discussion? Well, the discussion is, first, how do I create it, right? And for the list, you had the square bracket, you had this constructor to create a list. Here you have the single quote, right? And that's the string constructor. So, okay, let me just run the code and we'll talk through this, right? So clearly I can print something, but you can also create strings in Python with a double quote, okay? And the reason why we have single quote and double quote is because if you use the double quote to create the string, then you can put the single quote inside the string. I hope all of you can see, like in English, we say hello to Jill's Python course. The possessive has a single quote in it. So if I replace this double quote with a single quote, then Python will get confused and it will think that this Jill's apostrophe S is the end of the string. And then it won't know what to do with the other piece and it will break. Right? So it's convenient to have two different types of quotes so that you can actually use them where necessary. I want to suggest that we should always have a convention. My convention right now, and I'm still converting. I used to use double quotes always. I'm converting to use single quotes. So single quotes look like that, and we should use that all over the place. Okay. Now the last thing I want to show is there's yet another string. These are all strings that live on one line. There's also another way to create a multi-line string. So sometimes you want to make a banner and display a lot of information when you're making a game or something. Then you can actually put a triple quote, and the triple quote will allow you to create a multi-line string. Okay, so you can run this code. Just take a second, change the values and so on, and be comfortable. And in your mind, fix the idea that there are three different types of strings. The next interesting idea is there is actually this function called str, and maybe we used it a couple of times. This function str is the actual function whose job is to construct strings. And this we use as a type conversion function. So here, for example, we took a type which is an integer 1, 2, 3, and we said, can you make a string for me? And so I'm just showing you that if you actually run this, it actually creates a string, right? And it actually prints it out, okay? And then the last thing is the string constructor, just like the list constructor. If you remember, I think Mohit was asking a few questions last time. If you remember, the list constructor was able to take a string and break it up, right? The list constructor was able to take a string and break it up into characters, right? If you remember, we did something like vowels equals A, E, I, O, U or something. I don't know what string we used. But if you want to make this into a list, we could say L1 equals list, and then we could pass in vowels, right? Or we could just put this whole string in there just to make a comparison. So if you actually pass a string to the list constructor, it breaks it up and creates a list. So you would want the string constructor to do the opposite of that, right? If you give it a list, it's going to join it and make a string for you, okay? But it is not joining it, it's just making a string which contains the list. So you have to do some extra work to actually create a string with 1, 2 in it. Okay, we'll come to some of that stuff later. So what is the moral of the story? The moral of the story is there's always, when you encounter a new structure, you have to ask the question, how shall I create it? Is there more than one way to create it? And then how shall I convert other types that I know into this new structure that I am studying right now? So for example, how do I convert an integer to a string? How do I convert a floating point to a string? what happens if I use a Boolean, etc. Right? So I want you to have this pattern. This pattern will allow you to explore new